back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sesatris, and last week I wasn't here. I'm sorry about that. I was in a ton of pain. I had a tooth that hated me, and so I got that taken out. Not taken out, but I got it fixed on Monday, and so that week is done. So now I am back, and this week I wanted to do a review. I just finished reading The Terror by Dan Simmons, and I was originally just reading this just because I was like, well, it's September, and that's kind of when spooky season starts, and so I wanted to get into some horror. And I just got really engrossed in it, and it just had a lot of kind of literary merit that was really engaging and intriguing. And so I wanted to do a more in-depth review of this for you guys, because I feel like this is one of those books that it's easy to kind of gloss over, but this is a legitimately, like, it was a meaningful read, and it was compelling in cool ways. So I wanted to do a review of that. This book tells the story. It's based on a true story. It's the Franklin expedition that traveled searching for the Northwest Passage through the Arctic, and the ship was lost, and they never really found what happened to everyone. This kind of takes that, and it's very historically accurate, but it also adds in kind of some horror elements. There is a creature of some kind out on the ice that's hunting them, and it kind of adds to the whole thing. But this is a really compelling look at the attitudes of colonialism and the drive that kind of sent English explorers through just horrific landscapes, all in the pursuit of, like, profit. Like, it was searching for a way to India, so they, for trading of spices, and it was just, I don't know, there was depth here that I wasn't expecting. I was just expecting, creature feature, monster on the ice, and then like a bunch of people. But it really it had a lot of really interesting things to say, and so I wanted to give that kind of its due. So the way that I do these reviews, I have kind of 5 criteria. I rate them and then kind of add the score up, and then give the book an overall score at the end. And there's 3 different scores that something can get. If it gets a green light, then that means that it's great, wonderful, no notes. Yellow is it's pretty good, not great, it had some issues, whatnot. And then red light is it was bad, it was unsuccessful, I wasn't a fan. So we'll get started with this. The first criteria on this list is, do the characters feel like real people? And I'm going to have to say absolutely yes. This is told multiple POVs, there's a big cast of characters, and they're all really compelling. They feel like real people. There's not very many characters that I actually liked. There's a few that you kind of learn to tolerate over time, and there's some that you do genuinely like. But overall, it's a really interesting tactic when you have kind of a group of characters that, like, they're not really great people, even if their morals are kind of in the right place. Like, they think they're being a good person, and they're all doing this in favor of discovery and the Empire and everything. It's just, there's just something about all of them that it just seems a little creepy, and it becomes very clear early on that the real monster in this is sort of the white colonizer. But it's more nuanced than that, obviously, but that's kind of the vibe that you get pretty early on. And so it's really interesting to take these characters, some of whom you really dislike, and making you kind of care about their plight, because their ship is frozen in the Arctic. And that's not a spoiler, that happens like the first chapter. They're frozen in the Arctic, and they're kind of trying to survive while there's this thing out there on the ice. And I really appreciated the character arcs. I'd also like to give a shout out to, like, the Inuit characters. It's really impressive how Simmons was able to kind of portray their culture accurately, or fairly accurately. I'm obviously not an indigenous person, so if there's probably stuff that got wrong, but for the most part, it felt very respectful towards their culture, and they kind of at first you see them through the white character's eyes, and they don't like them at all. There's distrust, there's hate, there's all that kind of stuff. But as you get on, like as you go along, the Inuit characters really become kind of the most important characters in the whole book, and in really cool ways. I don't want to spoil anything, but it's really, really interesting how things end up playing out. And so for characters, I'm definitely giving this one a green light. It was really successful in how it kind of used characters to sort of keep the reader guessing, which I really appreciated. The next criterion is, did the writing style draw you in? And the answer to this is absolutely. I loved how this was written. The book is a little slow paced, and so there's times when it got a little sloggy, but the writing was what kept me going. That was kind of what kept me engaged. It feels like it was written in like the 19th century. Now, obviously, it's not completely, era specific, because there's, bad language that sailors of the time would have used, but in a lot of 19th century novels wouldn't have been allowed. There's also, of course, quite a bit of violence and gore and stuff that probably wouldn't have been included in a book like that. But for the most part, the dialogue feels very authentic. It doesn't feel like someone trying to kind of imitate a 19th century way of speaking. It really feels like this person knows what they're doing. And Dan Simmons is very much an English literature nerd, and I mean that in the best way. But it's very obvious that he has a feel for like how characters in 19th century novels spoke. And so the writing style is just gorgeous. And even when it's like horrifying, it still feels compelling and interesting. And it's quite a testament to his writing, because if you think about how many words there are to just describe that it's cold and snowy, and the landscape is sort of featureless cracked ice with a few bergs. Like, that's kind of what it is for most of the book. And he just keeps it endlessly interesting and compelling, even though it's kind of the same landscape over and over and over and over again. So the writing style was wonderful. It really felt like, Moby Dick or Mutiny on the Bounty or Treasure Island. It really kind of captured that nautical feel. And that kind of sense of exploration and everything, especially, exploration gone horribly wrong. But it really was compelling. It reminded me a lot of the film In the Heart of the Sea, which is kind of a very similar kind of story. It's the story of I think it's the USS Essex, who was destroyed by a sperm whale, the real life story that inspired Moby Dick. And that one is pretty horrifying as well. But this, it feels like it's part of a really grand tradition of like nautical adventure stories, but then it subverts it in really cool ways. But the writing style is gorgeous, and there's a few parts where it just gets really poetic, and he starts channeling like Emily Bronte, and it's just wonderful. The imagery and the characters, you really feel everything that they're going through, and the landscape and just the bitter cold. I didn't want to read this in winter. That's why I wanted to read it at the beginning of kind of the spooky season, because I did not want to read this during winter, and I'm glad I did, because this is the kind of book where if you read it during winter time when it was actually cold, you'd probably get frostbite for real. Like, it's a very icy, cold, bleak, windswept book, and the writing style is just gorgeous. It's just wonderful. So I'm definitely giving this one a green light. Next up is kind of a difficult one. This is, did the plot move at an appropriate pace? Now, I phrase it as appropriate pace for a reason, because the book is very slow paced. It's very slow burn. The horror doesn't really start to make itself known until later. It kind of shows all its cards pretty early on, so you kind of know the stakes, but it feels like it somehow deepens the horror as you go, and in order for that to work, it really has to be a slow progression, a very slow disintegration of things over time, because it takes place over 3 years. And so I feel like it did move at a pretty slow pace, And when I was reading it in the moment, the first half of the book did feel a little bit of a slog sometimes. Having finished it, it's very appropriate and it's a very satisfying conclusion, and so everything that came before it feels necessary, and it really makes everything that happens in the second half of the book feel earned. So I feel like it works, but it is a bit of a hard sell to people because it is kind of slow paced. And also there's some jumping around in time at the beginning that I feel like he did that to keep things interesting. He's able to kind of take some things from that happen later in the story and show them early to kind of keep people engaged and interested, to keep it from being really, really slow. But nonetheless, it is a little slow at first. Now, it ultimately works, and the book as a whole is very successful, and I don't feel like the pacing is bad having read it, but I am going to still give this a yellow light, just because it did feel like a bit of a slog at first. It took me, let's see, what's today? The 24th? So it took me 24 days to read this. It's quite long. The margins, now, I mean, this is just this edition, but the margins are, well, here we go. The margins are quite narrow, and the pages are quite thin. And so it's like 800 pages in this edition, but I feel like if it was like a I don't know, mass market paperback, it would be more like 800 or 900 pages. So it did feel like a bit of a slog at times, but you just have to kind of keep going with it. But for that reason, I am going to give this one a yellow light, just because I can see that some people might DNF this pretty early on, because it feels like nothing is going to happen. I think that's something that he does really well, is you feel like you kind of know all the stakes right away. He introduces this thing on the ice, he introduces that they're trapped on the ice really early on, and then kind of not a whole lot happens for a bit. And so it feels like you're like, okay, well, eventually, they're going to escape the monster and escape the ice, and then that's it. But he kind of subverts your expectations and changes things up. He's like once you get about a third of the way through, halfway through, things start changing, and the status quo keeps getting adjusted, and the goalposts keep moving. And so at that point, that's when the tension really ramps up, because things become more unpredictable, and you really have no clue where it's going to go. And so even though it is kind of slow at the beginning, and you are justified in kind of thinking it's like, oh, well, nothing else is really going to happen, I know kind of the what's going to happen in the book, I can see a lot of people giving up on it too soon. But I would just say stick with it. It's very worth it. It reminds me a lot of Stephen King's It, which, I think that one is paced a little bit better, even though that's another really long book. But it does very slowly build up to kind of the confrontation, and everything is kind of set up way in advance, and it takes a while to get there. So if you just be patient with this, you can get there. But I think that this book is not very kind to people who are expecting a lot more stuff to happen early on. You just have to stick with it, and then it's worth it. But for that reason, I am going to give this one a yellow light. Next up, the question is, were you still thinking about this after you finished it? Now, this isn't super fair in my case, because I just finished reading this like an hour ago. But this is definitely a book that's going to stick with you. It asks big questions. And it's not just the horrifying moments, because this is a horror book, and there are moments that are really crazy. But the book as a whole, it feels more like something like Moby Dick. Like Moby Dick ends in tragedy, and the Pequod's destroyed, and Captain Ahab's dead, and all that kind of stuff. But Moby Dick doesn't feel like a horror book. It kind of feels like a tragedy, like a Shakespearean tragedy. And this doesn't really feel like that. It does feel like a horror story. But it takes its time in setting things up, and it explores really interesting themes throughout. And so it's not just, relentless horror all the time. It's kind of, there's lots of philosophy and cultural analysis and just self-reflection from the characters that just makes it a little bit more than just kind of like a creature feature. It really feels, meaningful and compelling. And so for that, I'm gonna give this one a green light, because it does stick with you, and it's one of those books that I'm really glad that I read and that I stuck with, even though it was very long and it took me quite a long time to read it. I do appreciate having read it, because there's a lot of depth there, and there's a lot of big cosmic questions that it brings up that are just fun to mull about. So yes, I am going to give this one a green light for that. And so finally, the last criterion is, do you want to read it again? Because I think when a book is sort of rereadable, it really kind of shows that there's something special about that. And that's a difficult question to ask for this, because so much of what was interesting about this was being misled by the author and not knowing what was going to happen next, because you really have no clue where it's heading, the ultimate direction the story is going. And so it was really compelling to read, but I feel like if I reread it, the experience would be a little bit different, because I know what's coming. And so for one, it would be much less scary. And two, it would feel like too familiar. I don't know. So I'm going to say no for now, but this is probably something that I'm going to read in the future. So I'm not getting rid of it. I'm not going to be thrifting this, because I really loved this book and I want to keep it on my shelf, because in the future sometime I may want to reread it, because it was so well done. And so this is a book I'm going to keep recommending to people. And so with that said, I may not read it soon, and it might be like a decade before I read it again, because I know there's lots of foreshadowing and symbolism that sets things up that would be fun to catch kind of on a second reading. But for right now, I don't think I could reread it in even like the next 5 years, because it would be too familiar, because it was so good when I was reading it. It sticks in your head. And it would feel like you kind of get all the slog without any of the kind of payoff of like being surprised by the plot. So probably not going to reread this, but I'm not stacking that against it. I'm not going to give it a red light for that. I'm going to give this one a yellow light for this one, because you do kind of have to read it once, and the reading experience itself is part of what makes the book so good, because it drags you through this brutal, grueling experience, and then it kind of leads you down the garden path and subverts your expectations of kind of what's happening. So I don't know if this is a rereadable book, but in a decade or so I might give it another go, just to see if I can find things that I missed the first time, because it is a really delightful read. So I'll give this one a yellow light for that. So ultimately, that gives us the score of 3 green lights and 2 yellow lights, which converts to 4 green lights. So 4 out of 5, which I think is completely fair. This is, I wouldn't call this like the most perfect book ever, but it is a really well-crafted book. It's a compelling book. It's interesting. It makes you think, but it's also fun. Like, you know how in the movie Alien, the parts where the alien actually attacks people are almost kind of like moments of catharsis. It's like finally something can happen, because so much of the tension of that one is wandering around this old creaky ship, not knowing what's around the corner, and knowing that something is hunting you, but you don't know anything about it. And that's kind of where the tension comes from. That's what makes the movie good. And then when the alien shows up, it's like, but it's almost fun when it shows up, because it's like a release of tension, because you can see it finally. It's not hiding. And so that's kind of how this one feels. It's a study in atmosphere and slow build up of tension. If you want to read about kind of the real life story kind of behind this, there's a lot of books written about it, but the one that I know of that I have read is called Erebus by Michael Palin. Yes, that Michael Palin, the one from Monty Python. And it tells the story of the Erebus, which is the other ship in this one. It's the Terror and the Erebus, are the 2 ships. And it tells about their first kind of triumphant wonderful visit to the South Pole, and then their like disastrous, horrifying expedition to the North Pole, and it kind of contrasts the two journeys. And there's characters in that one that you'll see in this one, and it's just, I don't know, there's just something about the Franklin expedition. I think it's just because it was so avoidable. Like, they didn't need to travel to find the Northwest Passage for anything other than just making people rich in England. Like, there wasn't any desperate need. It's not like the ship got lost while trying to do something else, like a rescue mission for another ship, and it accidentally got caught in the ice. Like, it was a very preventable tragedy, and they went into the ice thinking that they were completely prepared, and they weren't even remotely prepared, and it was just a disaster. And so if you want to read about kind of the real life stuff, that's a really good book, and that was kind of what encouraged me to read this. I love Dan Simmons anyways. I've read his Hyperion Cantos, which I loved, but just having read kind of the real story, I was like, you know, this is a perfect setting to take that real life historical story and just make it as horrifying and strange as possible. And so that was quite interesting. So I would highly recommend this, but just know that while the ending is incredibly satisfying, it's not a pleasant reading experience. This will also make you compulsively drink orange juice all the time, because it instills in you a very specific fear of scurvy, just so you know. But with that said, I love this book, and I would really recommend it to anyone else. So with that, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, enjoy your reading. Bye.